She came into the office like a breeze that didn't ask for permission. I remember noticing her from the moment she walked in. Something about the way she moved, self-assured and unhurried, like the world bent slightly to accommodate her presence. She was new, young, a fresh face among our worn routines and predictable rhythms. People smiled at her more. She carried light in her eyes, not naivety, but something else, something fierce and curious and open. I didn't plan to pay attention. I had my world, its borders neatly drawn, its corners polished with habit. I had deadlines, meetings, a husband who texted rarely, and dinners that felt like silent routines. My life was not a place where surprises belonged. And yet, she unsettled something just by being there. It started with small things. Her sitting in on meetings I led, asking questions with a tilt of her head that felt too direct, too familiar. She laughed freely, the kind of laugh that turns heads. I noticed it, even when I pretended not to. She was smart, attentive, effortlessly confident, and I found myself looking forward to her voice during discussions. I brushed it off, called it professional admiration. But there was something else, something that made me adjust my hair more carefully before walking into the break room, something that made me pause before replying to her emails just to read her tone twice. She was assigned to shadow our team for a month. That meant lunches, short walks between departments, shared spreadsheets, and those moments when our eyes met across desks. Her presence began to fold into my day like an aftertaste I couldn't place. I told myself she was just young, vibrant, the kind of person people naturally gravitate toward. I told myself it was normal to be aware of someone new. I told myself a lot of things. One Thursday afternoon, the office emptied early after a false fire alarm. Most people took the excuse to leave and never returned. She stayed behind, said she had work to finish. I had a meeting to prepare for and stayed too. We ended up alone in the quiet hum of artificial lights and distant printer sounds. That was the first time I noticed how she looked when she concentrated. Brows slightly furrowed, lips parted, fingers tapping lightly on the table as if coaxing thoughts from the keys. I watched her longer than I should have. She caught my glance and smiled, not teasing, not questioning, just simple and soft. It shook something loose in me. After that, we started finding each other more often. Not deliberately, not obviously, but I'd walk into the break room and she'd be there. She'd come by my desk with questions she could have emailed. She'd stand next to me during meetings when there was plenty of room elsewhere. None of it meant anything, not on the surface, but the undercurrent was real. I felt it in my skin, in the way I straightened my posture when she entered a room, in the way my stomach tightened when I heard her laugh near my door. One day, she complimented my earrings, a small passing comment. I said thank you and went back to typing, but the skin around my ears burned for hours. I found myself wearing those earrings again the next day without even realizing it. That same afternoon, we ended up riding the elevator alone. She asked about my weekend plans. I stumbled through a vague answer. I asked about hers. She smiled and said she hadn't decided. When we reached her floor, she didn't get off right away. She stood still, met my gaze, and then stepped out slowly, like she wanted me to notice her leaving. I did. It was hard to explain why these moments clung to me. I wasn't someone who dwelled on brief glances or fleeting touches, but with her, everything seemed amplified. Her laughter at my jokes lasted longer than it needed to. Her hand once brushed mine as we reached for the same folder, and I felt it for the rest of the day. She was just a colleague. That's what I kept telling myself. A young woman with talent, energy, and nothing to hide. I had nothing to fear, and yet I had never felt more exposed. One evening, she stayed after hours again, said she had too much to do at her own place, and the quiet helped her focus. She looked tired, so I offered her tea. We sat in the small office kitchen, alone under flickering light, and for the first time, we didn't talk about work. She told me little things, how her lease was ending soon, how she hated packing, how she wasn't sure what came next. I listened, nodding in all the right places, but what I remember most is her voice, low, casual, with a hint of exhaustion and something more. Trust, maybe, or vulnerability. She leaned back in her chair, stretched her arms, and yawned without covering her mouth. It felt strangely intimate, like being let into a secret she didn't share with many. That night, I lay awake longer than I had in years. I stared at the ceiling, trying to locate the boundary that used to separate my thoughts so clearly. Something had shifted, and I could no longer pretend I didn't notice. Her face floated into my mind with sharp clarity, the way her lips curved when she smiled, the way she always tucked her hair behind her ear before speaking, the way she sometimes looked at me, really looked like she was waiting for something I hadn't yet said. I had no reason to feel this way, no excuse that would make sense, but the truth was already taking root somewhere deep inside me. I wasn't afraid of her. I was afraid of what I might do next. When she moved in, it wasn't supposed to mean anything. She had said it was temporary, a few nights until she found something else. Her lease had ended unexpectedly, and the friend she was supposed to stay with had backed out last minute. I offered without thinking, told her I had space, a guest room, clean sheets, extra towels. It felt like the right thing to do, like something anyone would offer. I told myself it didn't mean anything because it couldn't. But the moment she stepped through the door with her small suitcase and worn canvas bag, the air inside my home changed. She didn't bring much, just the essentials. A few outfits, a laptop, some books, a box of tea she liked. But her presence spread beyond those things. Her laughter echoed differently in the hallway. Her shampoo made the bathroom smell like wildflowers. Her shoes by the door looked too new beside mine. It wasn't just the physical things. It was the way she moved through the space. Confident, comfortable, like she'd lived there all along. She didn't tiptoe or ask permission. She poured coffee in the morning, curled up on the couch with her knees tucked under her, left her hairbrush on the counter. She filled the quiet with music I'd never heard before, soft and strange and beautiful. At first, I tried to maintain distance. We lived under the same roof, but I told myself I needed boundaries. I kept to my room more often, turned in earlier than usual, avoided lingering too long in shared spaces. But she made it hard. She would knock gently on my door to ask about dinner, or appear behind me in the kitchen just as I was setting 2 plates out without realizing. She had a way of slipping into the moment, unannounced but never unwelcome. Her presence was warm, like sunlight through sheer curtains, gentle, constant, impossible to ignore. We began cooking together in the evenings. It started casually, me preparing something and her offering to help, but soon it became routine. We moved easily around each other, without bumping or hesitating, like we had rehearsed this 1,000 times. Her hand would brush mine as she passed the salt, her hip would press lightly into mine as we stood at the stove. Small things, unremarkable to anyone else, but I felt them like sparks on my skin. She had the habit of talking to herself when she worked. Not full conversations, just murmurs, half-thoughts spoken aloud. Sometimes I would hear her in the guest room, pacing, typing, sighing. Her voice became a background hum to my evenings. I would sit in bed with a book and find myself listening for her footsteps. The house no longer felt empty. It felt lived in. It felt alive. One night, she fell asleep on the couch. We had been watching a movie, something light and forgettable. She curled up beside me, head on a cushion, her legs tucked beneath her. Somewhere between the second and third act, she dozed off. I didn't move. I turned the volume down and watched the soft rise and fall of her breath. Her lips were slightly parted, her hand resting loosely near her face. I studied the shape of her lashes, the curve of her cheek, the way one strand of hair clung to her temple. I told myself I was only looking because I didn't want to wake her, but the truth pulsed under my ribs. I didn't want the moment to end. The guest room door stayed open more often after that. I would walk past and catch glimpses of her, folding laundry, reading, tying her hair up in that loose way that always exposed the back of her neck. She moved without self-consciousness, without effort. I started noticing how quiet my world had been before her, how predictable, how flat. She made tea in the evenings, a ritual I quickly adopted. She brewed it slowly, carefully, letting the aroma fill the space before pouring. We would sit in the living room, the lights low, her feet tucked under a blanket, my legs crossed beneath me. We talked about nothing and everything, movies, books, the weather, work. But it was the silences that started to say more. Long pauses that didn't feel empty. Glances that lingered longer than they should have. Her eyes would find mine across the room and hold, not daring, but steady. I found myself holding my breath without knowing why. I started adjusting to her rhythms. I woke earlier just to catch the sound of her humming in the kitchen. I took longer in the bathroom when I knew she was nearby, listening to the way the floorboards creaked under her feet. Her presence seeped into my routines. My sweaters disappeared from hangers and reappeared on her shoulders. My playlists included songs she had introduced me to. My thoughts included her without invitation. Sometimes she would sit too close. On the couch, at the table, on the floor while we played cards. Her thigh would press against mine, warm and casual. Her arm would rest along the back of the couch, fingers trailing close to my shoulder. She never apologized, never explained, and I never asked her to move. If anything, I shifted closer. The space between us grew thinner, not in distance, but in something else, something unnamed. I stopped locking the door to my bedroom, not because I expected her to come in, but because I wasn't sure I would stop her if she did. I started dreaming about her, not vividly, not always clearly, but she was there, a constant shape in the background of my sleeping thoughts. I would wake with a strange ache in my chest, an unspoken wish lodged between my ribs. I told myself nothing had changed, but it had. The space I had once called mine no longer belonged only to me. She was everywhere, in the scent of my pillow, in the coffee mug on the table, in the quiet hum of the house after midnight. And I didn't want her to leave, even if I couldn't say why, even if I was afraid to admit what her nearness had begun to mean. It happened on a night when the air felt unusually still. There had been a sharp drop in temperature, and the heating in the house had chosen the worst time to falter. I had offered her extra blankets earlier, made sure the guest room had everything she needed to stay warm. She smiled and thanked me, her voice soft, her hands wrapped around the mug of tea I had made. We went about our usual routine, dinner, a movie, quiet conversation that lingered just long enough to leave something unsaid. But when I finally retreated to my room, the silence felt heavier than usual. I slid under the covers, turned off the light, and closed my eyes. Still, I couldn't sleep. The knock on my door was gentle, barely audible, a soft rhythm that seemed to echo inside me more than in the room. I opened it to find her standing there, wrapped in a blanket, her hair tousled, her eyes wide and uncertain. She said it was too cold. Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, not from nerves, just the cold, or at least that's what I told myself. I stepped aside without a word, and she entered like she belonged. She walked quietly to the other side of the bed and slid under the covers. I turned off the lamp and lay back, trying to focus on my breathing. The warmth of her body found me almost immediately. She stayed close, but not too close, respectful of a boundary we both knew existed but no longer made sense. Her presence was like gravity, pulling at something inside me, drawing my awareness to the space between us. I closed my eyes and tried to ignore it, but she moved, not deliberately, not with intent, but with the restless shift of someone seeking comfort. Her leg brushed mine, her shoulder grazed my arm, and suddenly the entire bed felt smaller. I could feel her breathing, steady, measured, just inches away. I could smell her shampoo, faint and floral, familiar now. I lay rigid, unsure of where to place my hands, my thoughts, my heart. Time passed in slow, aching beats. Then I felt her fingers, light at first, like a question whispered against my skin. They brushed my hand, hesitated, then stayed. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Every nerve in my body was already leaning toward her, even if I hadn't moved an inch. She shifted closer, her knee pressing softly into my thigh. I could feel the heat radiating from her, warm and enveloping, like sunlight breaking through morning fog. Her hand found mine fully now, her fingers slipping between mine with a quiet certainty. Still, neither of us spoke. There was no need. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was charged, alive, waiting. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding, and found her watching me in the dim light that crept in from the hallway. Her eyes held something I had never seen before, something deeper than curiosity, more fragile than desire. They searched mine, not for permission, but for presence. I gave it. Without words, without movement, I let her know I was here, with her, for her. Whatever this was, wherever it was going, I wasn't going to turn away. Her face moved toward mine with hesitant grace, and when her lips touched mine, the world fell into silence. It wasn't a kiss of urgency. It was slow, intentional, full of something ancient and new at the same time. Her mouth was soft, warm, and familiar in a way that should have felt impossible. I kissed her back because I didn't know how not to. My hand slid to her waist, feeling the curve of her through the fabric of her shirt, and she exhaled into the kiss as if she'd been holding her breath for days. She pressed closer, her body aligning with mine in a way that felt both inevitable and surreal. The blanket shifted around us as our legs tangled gently beneath it. Her hand rested on my hip, fingers flexing slightly, not to control, but to connect. Every point of contact between us was electric. My skin buzzed, my chest tightened, my thoughts scattered like dust. She deepened the kiss, and I responded without hesitation, letting instinct take over where thought had failed. She deepened the kiss, and I responded without hesitation, letting instinct take over where thought had failed. I rolled slightly onto my back, and she followed, half draped over me, her hair falling in a curtain that blocked out the rest of the world. Her lips left mine and moved to my neck, her breath hot and shallow. I felt her teeth graze my skin, not hard, just enough to make me shiver. My hand slid under the hem of her shirt, finding the bare skin of her waist, and she arched into my touch like it was a relief. I couldn't stop touching her. My fingers traced her spine, memorizing the delicate lines of her back. She shifted again, straddling my thigh, her hands braced on either side of my head. I looked up at her in the faint light and saw everything: fear, longing, tenderness, need. She leaned down, kissed me again, slower this time, and I felt her hand slide beneath the hem of my sleep shirt. Her palm rested just above my navel, warm and steady, grounding me in the moment. We undressed each other without urgency. Her hands moved with reverence, mine with quiet hunger. Every inch of exposed skin felt like a confession. I touched her with a reverence I hadn't known I was capable of. Her body was lithe and strong, soft in the places that made me ache. When she lay back beside me and pulled me against her, I followed without hesitation. Her thigh slid between mine, and the friction made me gasp. We moved together slowly, as if afraid to break the spell. Her hands found my chest, my hips, the small of my back. She whispered something I didn't catch, her breath warm against my collarbone. I responded with my body, pressing into her, letting her guide me into a rhythm that was both unfamiliar and somehow perfect. I felt her lips on my shoulder, my breast, my stomach. I arched into her, desperate and unafraid. When her hand slipped between my thighs, I trembled. She touched me carefully, as if memorizing every reaction. I gasped, clutching her wrist, not to stop her, but to anchor myself. Her fingers moved with purpose, slow and steady, coaxing sounds from me I didn't know I could make. I buried my face in her neck, my breath breaking as the tension in my body built. And when it crested, I shattered, silently, completely. My body convulsed beneath her, every nerve on fire, every thought burned away. She held me through it, never letting go, never looking away. When I opened my eyes, she was still watching me, still with me, still here. We stayed like that for a long time, limbs tangled, heart slowing. I rested my head against her chest and listened to her breath. My fingers traced patterns across her stomach, lazy, content, lost in the quiet aftermath. There was no shame, no guilt, just a strange, aching peace. That night, I didn't dream. I didn't need to. I had lived something I never thought possible, something real, something I couldn't name but no longer wanted to deny. The morning light crept in slowly, soft and diffused, casting long, pale lines across the sheets. I woke with a start, not from sound or movement, but from the unfamiliar stillness in my chest, a silence that came only after something irreversible had passed. My body ached in places I had forgotten could feel pleasure. My skin still hummed with the warmth of her. Her scent clung to the pillow beside mine, to the sheets twisted around our legs, to my own skin. She was lying next to me, still asleep, one arm draped loosely across her stomach, her lips slightly parted. She looked peaceful, untouched by the weight settling slowly on my shoulders. I stayed still, afraid to move, afraid that if I shifted even slightly, the entire night would shatter and prove itself a dream. My gaze followed the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the curve of her collarbone exposed beneath the sheet, the faint imprint of my fingertips on her side. Everything felt unreal, yet undeniable. My mouth remembered the taste of her, my hands the feel of her skin, my heart the sound of her moaning my name in the dark. But alongside the memory bloomed something heavier, something sharp and slow, the understanding that there was no going back. When I finally slipped out of bed, I moved like I was made of glass, my limbs uncertain, my breath held too long. I walked to the kitchen, my steps light, almost cautious, as though the walls might accuse me. I stood by the sink, staring at nothing, gripping the edge of the counter as if it might ground me. The house felt different. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was too still, too loud with the echo of what we had done. I turned on the kettle just to fill the room with noise. While the water boiled, I glanced down at my hands. They looked the same, but didn't feel like mine. I could still feel the memory of her fingers laced through them. I could still feel the pressure of her thighs around my waist, the heat of her breath on my neck. It all lived beneath the surface now, stitched into me in a way I couldn't untangle. I wasn't ashamed. That surprised me. I wasn't even panicked. but I was something I couldn't name, something fragile and wide open. When I returned to the bedroom, she was awake, sitting up against the headboard, blanket pulled over her chest, her hair a tousled halo around her face. She looked at me and smiled softly, as if nothing had changed, as if this morning was like any other. I handed her a mug of tea without speaking, and she took it, our fingers brushing briefly. The heat from the mug passed through both of us, but we didn't look away. We didn't speak. The silence between us wasn't tense, but it was full of questions, full of knowing, full of the things we were too careful to say out loud. We dressed in the quiet, slowly, separately. Her shirt had ended up on my side of the bed, mine tangled on the floor. I watched her from the corner of my eye as she moved, graceful and unhurried. She didn't seem regretful. She didn't seem uncertain. But I couldn't read her completely. Part of me wanted to ask, what now? What does this mean? Are we going to pretend? But I stayed silent. I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the answer. That day passed in pieces. I went through the motions, emails, meetings, forced smiles, but I was somewhere else entirely. My body felt distant, like a costume. My mind was full of snapshots from the night before, her hand tracing down my spine, the way she whispered my name like a secret, the way she had looked at me when I touched her. I couldn't stop replaying it. I didn't want to. But with every replay came a wave of something heavier, the weight of what I had crossed, the boundary that had always been there, unspoken, now erased. By evening, she was back on the couch, her knees tucked under her, reading. I stood in the hallway and watched her, my heart aching with the sharpness of something I couldn't control. She looked up, saw me, and smiled again, that same soft smile that didn't demand anything. I sat beside her, close but not touching. We watched a movie, but I couldn't follow the plot. My eyes kept drifting to her. Her arm brushed mine once, and I flinched, not because I didn't want it, but because I wanted it too much. Later, when she yawned and stood to head to the guest room, she paused. For a moment, I thought she would say something, but she didn't. She simply looked at me for a heartbeat too long, then disappeared down the hall. I sat alone, my pulse racing, my thoughts spinning. I wanted to go after her. I wanted to pull her back, kiss her again, tell her I didn't want the night we shared to be a single moment trapped in memory. But I stayed where I was, frozen, not by fear of her, but by fear of everything else. That night, I lay in bed wide awake, staring at the ceiling, the sheets cool and unfamiliar without her. The memory of her body beside mine pulsed like a heartbeat through the room. I ached for her, not just for her touch, but for her presence, for the way she made me feel seen, alive. The thought of returning to the version of life I'd been living before her felt suffocating, but the idea of stepping fully into whatever this was between us felt just as terrifying. Some things, once done, can't be undone. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed. I had crossed into a space where I could no longer pretend, and now the only thing left was to figure out if she had crossed with me or if I was standing here alone, staring back at something that could never be what it was again. The days after the night we shared stretched into a quiet rhythm that felt both familiar and strange. On the surface, nothing had changed. We still drank tea in the evenings, still shared meals, still moved around each other with the ease we had always known. But underneath, something had shifted. I could feel it in the way she looked at me now, longer, slower, with a softness that carried 1,000 unspoken words. I could feel it in myself, too, in the way my body reacted to her presence, in the way my breath caught when she entered a room, in the way I began to crave her nearness even more than I feared it. We didn't talk about what had happened. Not because it wasn't real, but because it was too real. Naming it felt dangerous, like it might collapse under the weight of definition. But the truth of it lived in every glance, every pause, every brush of skin. When she passed behind me and her hand rested briefly on my lower back, when our fingers touched reaching for the same dish, when we lay beside each other on the couch and our knees pressed together, none of it was accidental. Each moment stacked upon the last, building something quiet but undeniable. I began to lose myself in the details, the way she bit her lip when she read, the faint freckles on her shoulder, the curve of her neck as she leaned over the kitchen counter. These things lived in me now, vivid and constant, like a second heartbeat. I found myself anticipating her movements, predicting when she would shift closer, waiting for the inevitable electricity that surged when our bodies touched. And when it didn't happen, I missed it. But outside our home, the world had no idea. I still answered my husband's calls, still played the part I had written for myself long ago. The conversations were shorter now, emptier. His voice sounded distant, mechanical, a sound that no longer stirred anything in me. I listened, I responded, but I wasn't really there. I was in the living room, thinking about her curled up with a book. I was in the hallway, remembering the night her mouth traced lines down my body. I was everywhere and nowhere all at once. The split between my two lives became more difficult to maintain. At work, I found it hard to focus. I caught myself staring at blank documents, my thoughts drifting to the way she had kissed me, the way her fingers had moved over my skin with reverence. When people asked if I was okay, I nodded and smiled, but inside, I was unraveling. I couldn't contain the truth anymore, couldn't confine it to the walls of my bedroom or the hush of the night. It followed me everywhere. At home, she began to leave traces of herself in every room. Her scarf on the dining chair, her book face down on the coffee table, a half-drunk mug of tea beside the sink. These objects weren't clutter, they were anchors, proof that she was here, that she existed in this space with me. And yet, with every new trace came a deeper sense of longing. I wanted more, not just of her presence, but of her certainty. I needed to know if she felt the same ache I did, if she lay in her bed remembering the heat of my mouth on her skin, if she wondered, like I did, what came next. There were moments when I thought she would say something. Her eyes would linger, her body would turn toward mine, and for a breath, the air between us would grow dense with possibility. But then the moment would pass, and we would return to the safety of silence. I told myself I was being patient, that this needed time. But patience became another kind of pain, a quiet, beautiful torture that lived in my bones. One night, I found her sitting on the kitchen floor, leaning against the cabinets, her knees drawn to her chest, the room dim and quiet. I sat beside her without a word, our shoulders touching. We stayed like that for a long time, not speaking, not moving, just breathing together. It felt like confession without sound, a declaration made in stillness. When I finally stood and reached for her hand to pull her up, she didn't hesitate. Her fingers slid into mine easily, naturally, like they had always belonged there. We began to share a bed more often. Sometimes we touched, sometimes we didn't. But even on the nights when we didn't, the space between us felt sacred. Her breath in the dark was the lullaby I didn't know I needed. Her warmth beside me was the only thing that kept the cold from seeping in too far. I memorized the rhythm of her sleeping body, the way her chest rose and fell, the way her arm would reach out in the middle of the night and find mine. I let her find me, every time. And yet, the fear never fully left. It lingered in the back of my mind, whispering questions I didn't want to answer. What happens if this ends? What happens if she leaves? What happens when my carefully constructed world demands answers I can't give? I wasn't ready to face those questions, but I also knew I couldn't keep hiding. I had stepped into something too deep, too consuming to retreat now. I stood in front of the mirror one morning, looking at myself like I was a stranger. My reflection held traces of the woman I had been, composed, controlled, distant, but it also carried something new. My eyes were softer, my mouth more uncertain. There was a flush in my skin that hadn't been there before, a glow born not from guilt, but from being touched with intention, from being seen, from being chosen. She came up behind me then, resting her chin on my shoulder, her arm slipping around my waist. Our eyes met in the mirror, and for a moment, I didn't see the reflection of two people pretending. I saw us, real and raw. I closed my eyes and leaned back into her, letting the truth of it settle into my bones. There was no more pretending, no more shrinking. We had stepped into a place where we could no longer hide. And despite the fear, despite the risk, despite everything that waited on the other side of this moment, I didn't want to go back. I couldn't. It began with a single sentence, spoken too casually, too softly, like it wasn't meant to land the way it did. She said she was looking for a new place. Just browsing, nothing serious, just in case. I remember the way she avoided my eyes when she said it, the way her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her mug. The words hit me like a quiet impact, something that made no sound but left a bruise. I nodded and said nothing, but the ache started to bloom almost instantly, slow and suffocating, winding its way through my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine the house without her, the empty guest room, the silence in the kitchen, the absence of her breath beside me in the dark. I tried to picture going back to how things were before she moved in, before her scent filled my sheets and her laughter filled the corners of my day. But my mind refused to form the image. It felt wrong, incomplete, like something had been removed that was never supposed to be temporary in the first place. For so long, I had lived in between wanting and not daring, between presence and denial, between what I had and what I longed for. But now, with her words hanging in the air, with the possibility of her leaving turning into something real, that fragile balance began to collapse. I couldn't pretend anymore that this was just about convenience or loneliness or proximity. It had become about love, real, terrifying, undeniable love. The next few days passed in a blur. We moved through the same rooms, ate the same meals, followed the same patterns, but everything felt different. I watched her more closely, memorizing details like I might not get to see them again. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she read, the way she laughed when she caught me watching her, the way she reached for my hand absent-mindedly while talking about something ordinary. These moments felt precious and finite, like I was already grieving them. She didn't bring it up again. She didn't pack, she didn't search out loud, but the silence between us was no longer soft. It was waiting for me to say something, waiting for a choice I hadn't yet made. I realized then that she was giving me time, space, the freedom to decide if I would meet her halfway or let her walk away. And for the first time, the question wasn't about what I wanted. It was about what I was willing to risk. One evening, I found her in the kitchen, barefoot, wearing one of my old shirts that hung loose around her frame. She was humming to herself, the soft melody barely audible over the sound of the simmering pot on the stove. I stood in the doorway and watched her, heart pounding, throat tight. I wanted to tell her not to go. I wanted to say it out loud, to put the words in the air and give them weight. But all I managed was to cross the room and stand behind her, close enough to feel the heat from her back, close enough for her to feel my hesitation. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting mine with a kind of patience that undid me. She didn't ask me anything. She didn't push. She just waited. And in that moment, I knew. I couldn't let her leave, not because I was afraid of being alone, not because I couldn't bear the silence, but because she had become the truth of me. She had become the mirror I hadn't known I needed, the touch that brought me back to life, the presence that made every room feel like home. I didn't just want her, I loved her. Later that night, she climbed into bed beside me like she always did. We lay in the dark, our fingers loosely intertwined, our bodies quiet but close. I turned toward her, pulled her closer, pressed my forehead to hers. There were no grand speeches, no declarations, just breath and closeness and choice. And when she kissed me, it wasn't with urgency. It was with trust, with clarity, with the kind of tenderness that only comes from being chosen fully, without condition. The next morning, I opened my eyes to find her already awake, watching me. Her expression was calm, unreadable, but her thumb moved slowly across the back of my hand. I held her gaze and nodded, a small, firm movement that said everything I hadn't yet said. I wasn't going to let her leave. I was choosing her. Over the next few weeks, small things shifted. Her clothes stayed in the same drawers. Her toothbrush never left its place. She stopped looking at apartment listings. I stopped pretending I could live without her. We didn't need to define it. We didn't need to explain it. It was ours. Quiet, steady, real. The fear didn't vanish overnight. There were still moments when the world outside felt sharp, where the weight of my old life pulled at me. But every time I started to slip, I looked at her, curled up on the couch, cooking dinner in her bare feet, laughing at something I said, and I remembered what it felt like to live half a life. I wasn't going back. There are places in the heart that only open when you stop hiding. Places that require you to stand still in your fear and choose anyway. I had reached that place, and I had chosen her, not because it was easy, but because it was true, because some things are worth losing everything else for. And now, every night she pulls the blankets up around us and sighs into the space between my neck and shoulder. I know this is where the choice lives, not in a single moment, not in a grand gesture, but in the quiet, daily decision to stay, to reach, to hold, and never let go.